Greetings, dear friends. In this issue, we open one of the most important chapters of positional play, the isolated queen's pawn problem. This is not just a chess topic, it is a cardinal dilemma. Is the static weakness of this pawn worth the immense dynamic strength that it grants to the owner? We will learn to distinguish the illusion of freedom of a pawn from a real threat. Figure out why outposts on the e5 and c5 squares are more important for attack than endgame fears. And finally deal with the family chronicle of hanging pawns. But that's not all. We will touch on a topic that is still debated: two bishops. Is this advantage a magical, strategic technique, or is it just a kind of weapon that requires cold-blooded calculation? We will show how two bishops turn into a crushing mechanism, and why their main weakness, the defenselessness of the fields of the opposite color, can be fatal for the owner. We will analyze how the range of bishops defeats the shortness of breath of the knight, and when it is worth preferring a solid formation to a direct attack. From the classic ideas of Nimzowitsch to the masterful games of Rubinstein and Alekhine, preparing your boards will be deep, instructive, and truly strategic. Don't miss out. We continue to dissect the art of chess struggle. 1. Isolated queen's pawn. The problem of the isolated queen's pawn, in my opinion, belongs to the cardinal problems of the entire positional game in general. The point is to evaluate a statically weak pawn, which, however, for all its weakness, is full of dynamic strength. What in this case outweighs, static weakness or dynamic strength? Thus, the question under consideration acquires significance and goes even beyond the narrow framework of a chess game. The student needs to approach the problem himself, on the basis of his own experience. When playing white, let him try to reach the so-called normal position: d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, e3, c5, knight c3, knight c6, and then plays alternately, in one game, bishop d3, c takes d, e takes d, d takes c, bishop takes c4, and white has an isolated queen's pawn. And in the other, c takes d, e takes d, d takes c, bishop takes c5, and white has to fight against an isolated queen's pawn. Pawn, pawn, pawn. This is a great exercise, for it will be useful for the student to see by experience how formidable the enemy's isolated pawn can become in the middle of the game, and on the other hand, he will see how difficult it is to save his own isolated pawn from death in the endgame. Below I will give a few instructive indications, the result of my many years of research, which can serve as a support for the student on his thorny path. But I cannot save him from passing through this path, for only bitter experience allows you to get the truth. A. Dynamic strength of the d4 pawn. Isolated queen's pawn diagram. Point c5 and e5 are outposts for white. Point d5 is an outpost for black. The dynamic power of the isolated queen's pawn is rooted in its energy of advancement, the tendency d for d5, and in the fact that this pawn defends, moreover, creates the outpost points e5 and c5. Isolated queen's pawn. Comparison of outposts e5 for white and d5 for black. In contrast to these benefits, black's outpost on d5, at least in the middle of the game, cannot be considered a full-fledged compensation, since, apart from the arithmetic advantage, two outposts against one, the fact that the knight on e5 acts much more sharply than its antagonist, the knight on d5, also speaks in favor of white. After all, it is obvious that, supported by two strong diagonals for bishops, d3 h7 and g5 f6, the e5 knight puts pressure on the entire enemy kingside, and what could be more sharp than an attack on the king? But on the other hand, our isolated pawn is known to represent a weakness in the endgame. How do we understand this? Are all the difficulties only in the fact that the d4 pawn is difficult to defend, or are there other unfavorable moments? B. An isolated pawn is a weakness in the endgame. The guiding point in the analysis of the problem is the fact that the points e5 and d5 should be evaluated differently in the endgame than in the middle of the game, because since the attack on the king is no longer possible, the shine of the e5 square is greatly dimmed, and the d5 point, on the contrary, wins in value. And if white hasn't had time yet, say, to penetrate c7 with a rook or doesn't have any other advantages gained in the middle of the game, his position should be considered unenviable. The difficulty lies not only in the constant need to defend an isolated pawn, but also in the fact that white squares such as d5, c4, e4 can become weak. Take a look at diagram 61 and imagine a white king on c4, a bishop on d2, a black king on c6, and a knight on e7. Black, by means of knight check, pushes the king off the c4 square, then plays kd5 and penetrates his king further, via c4 or e4. In all such cases, the point d5 is the key of the position. All the operations of blocking, centralizing, and maneuvering are performed around and around the d5 square. The d5 point serves as the gate for invasion, as well as the nodal point for all kinds of regroupings of forces. For example, let us imagine the situation in diagram 61 with rooks and knights, rd8, d5, a5, and f6, d5, b4, and finally in f6, d5, e7, f5, d4. A knight located on d5 has a significant impact on both flanks. The bishop on d5 often decides the game even with opposite-colored bishops, for example, if there are rooks on both sides. Of course, black's advantages can be compensated by something, say, the invasion of the white rook on c7, but these cases should be considered only as exceptions to the rule. To summarize, white's weakness in the endgame in our case lies in the fact that d4 is threatened, while d5 is extremely strong. The white squares d5, c4, e4 have been weakened, while e5, white's original strength, has lost much of its meaning. White's pawn position was not compact. The shortcomings we have noted, such as, for example, a thorough weakening of the complex of squares of a certain color, are the usual companions of a small compact, broken pawn arrangement. In practice, a healthy instinct for evaluating compact or non-compact positions is of great importance, and it is not so much a matter of the isolated pawn as of the entire weakened complex of squares surrounding it. C. Isolated pawn as a mid-game attack weapon. Many chess players, having received an isolated pawn, start an attack that is too fast. However, it seems to me that there are no objective grounds for playing all in. At the beginning, a highly solid game is more appropriate. The attack will appear by itself. For example, if black takes away, say, the f6 knight from the king side, which is natural, since the knight tends to d5. So, at the stage of development, we recommend a solid construction, b3, not bg5, qe2, rc1 and rd1, not rd1 and 1 rupee, then bd3 or bb1, not bb3. We consider it necessary to warn against attempts at rapid attacks in the early game in the hope of catching the opponent by surprise. For example, in xf7 in the bishop's position on a2 or sabotage re1, e3 h3, in the most serious way. The only correct one is a solid formation, the basis of which is the defense of the point d4. Only after black has withdrawn his pieces from the king side can white launch an attack. Then they can even play in a sacrificial style. I don't mind. Take a look at the position. White's development is carried out properly, but only the move in f6. e8 gives him the opportunity to move on to a direct attack on the king, which is so desirable in all such cases. The result of the attack in this case is difficult to predict, but since it is generally typical for situations with an isolated pawn, we will give several options. For example, knight e8, black plays na8 to occupy the d6 square with the knight. For white, this is a signal to attack. Queen h5, g6. If f5 then, bishop g5. Queen h6, knight g7. Or f6, knight g4. Bishop g5. The pieces are now coming out of a calm, expectant state. f6. Bishop takes g6. H takes g. Knight takes g6. And now there are two options, depending on whether the queen retreats to d7 or d6. In the first case, in addition to bh4, a combinational continuation of bxf6 is also possible. For example, queen d7. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes f6. Queen h8. King f7. Knight e5. King e8. Knight takes d7. Rook takes h8. Knight takes f6 with 3 pawns per piece. In the case of queen d6, white can continue the catavasia he has begun, at least by queen h8. King f7. Queen h7. F takes g. Knight e5. King e8. Queen takes g7. Queen e7. Queen g6. King d8. Rook c6 with romantically tinged complications. So, let's note again, a solid formation, defending an isolated pawn by way b3. An attack only at the moment when the opportunity presents itself. D. Which cases are favorable for white, and which are favorable for black? In general, we can establish that the following two cases are beneficial for white. 1. White performed the maneuver d4 d5, ex d5. The piece beats d5, and thus obtained a better, centralized position. Rubinstein, Taubenhaus, Baden-Baden, 1925. 2. White is strong in the C line, in the game Nimzowitsch, Taubenhaus, St. Petersburg, 1930. In favor of black, the following are added. 1. All cases of a definitely endgame nature, of course, all other things being equal. 2. Cases in which black played nxc3 in order to fix the c3 pawn after bxc3's answer and eventually block it. See the game Thomas, Alekhine, as well as the note to the 15th move. Let's now watch the game Rubinstein, Taubenhaus. Knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, d takes c, e3, c5, bishop takes c4, a6, a4, knight c6, short castling, bishop e7, queen e2, c takes d, rook d1, short castling, knight takes d4, queen c7, knight takes c6, queen takes c6, e4, b6, bishop g5, h6, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight d5, bishop g5, rook ac1, e takes d, bishop takes d5, queen g6, bishop takes a8, bishop takes c1, rook takes c1, bishop h3, f4, rook takes a8, f5, queen g5, rook c3, bishop g4, queen f2, rook d8, h3, rook d2, queen g3, bishop d1, queen b8, king h7, rook g3, queen d8, queen b7, bishop h5, queen takes a6, queen d4, king h2, bishop e2, queen b7, rook d1, rook c3, queen e5, g3, queen d4, e4, knight f6, d3, c5, f4, knight c6, knight f3, g6, bishop e2, bishop g7, knight bd2, d5, short castling, king h1, b6, e takes d, queen takes d5, queen e1, bishop b7, knight c4. This position of the knight serves as a weak consolation for the lack of harmony in white's formation, b2. Black's position is much better. White should have played c2, c4 on move 5 or earlier. Knight d4, outpost on line d. Knight e3, queen c6, bishop d1, knight d5, knight takes d4, c takes d, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop f3, queen d7, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7. White made his situation easier with an exchange, but the open c-file forces him to make the following weakening move. c4, d takes c, b takes c, rook ac8, bishop b2, rook fd8, rook f3, bishop f6, d4. Now the pawns are arranged as in the well-known position of the Queen's Gambit, in which, however, white and black seem to have switched roles. To make sure of this, let's consider the following consulting batch for comparison. Queen d5, queen e3, queen b5, queen d2, rook d5, h3, e6, rook e1, queen a4, rook a1, b5, queen d1, rook c4. Partial use of the open line, or the c line as a springboard. We draw attention to the coincidence of maneuvers in the consulting and cited parties. Queen b3, rook d6, king h2, rook a6. The d line is also used as a springboard. Rook ff1, bishop e7, king h1, rook cc6. Very subtle. Black plots a regrouping. qc4, ra4, and rca6. Rook fa1, bishop h4, rook f1. White must not weaken his own base by moving the rook away from the first rank. For example, rook e5, queen takes b3, a takes b, rook takes a1, bishop takes a1, rook a6, bishop b2, rook a2, and black wins. Queen c4, queen takes c4, rook takes c4 in exchange for black's hand, as the a2 pawn becomes very weak. It is useful for the student to note that the exchange here was the result of the mere occupation of strategically important points. It took place, so to speak, automatically. The beginner tries to achieve the exchange in other ways. He pursues the piece he has planned, and unsuccessfully. The master occupies strong points, and the desired exchange is given to him like a ripe fruit. a3, bishop e7, rook fb1, bishop d6, g3, king f8, king g2, king e7. Centralization of the king. King f2, king d7, king e2, king c6, rook a2, rook ca4, rook ba1, king d5. Centralization completed. King d3, rook 6a5, bishop c1, a6, bishop b2, h5. A new attack, but one that is a logical consequence of playing on the queen side. In fact, white's rooks are chained to the a pawn, and even if we were to assume that black's rooks are equally immobile, which is not entirely true, since they can be brought into play through the c4 square, black still has an undoubted advantage in the king's more active position. That this advantage can be of any importance at all, for it would be conditional with the enemy's rooks moving, again follows here only from the fact that the white rooks are very cramped as a result of the sabotage undertaken by the enemy. Thus, black's attack on the queen side to a large extent increased the importance of greater mobility in the center of his own king. The strategic contact between the two outwardly separated bridgeheads is thus proven, and so is the king's side. The move h7 h5 is intended to cause h3 h4 so that black's e6 e5 will have a stronger effect. The g3 pawn becomes fixed. An extremely instructive case from a positional point of view, which we recommend to the attention of the student. h4, f6, bishop c1, e5, a breakthrough that decides the fate of the game. F takes e, bishop b2, e takes d, c takes d, b4. However obvious this move is, it should still be admired by every connoisseur that the only purpose of the breakthrough was to eliminate the interfering c3 pawn. This ability to moderate one's desires is the best decoration of a master. A takes b, rook takes a2, b takes a, rook takes b2. White resigned. The partial use of the open line was carried out here masterfully. E reflects weakness of queenside pawns. An indicator of the weakness of an isolated queen's pawn is that the attacker often gets the opportunity to shift the attack from the queen's pawn to the queenside. Such a case of reflected weakness could be observed in the game Rubinstein-Duras. Let's refresh our memory of this game. c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, g3, bishop b4, bishop g2, short castling, knight f3, rook e8, short castling, knight c6. The exchange on c3 deserved attention. Knight d5, bishop f8, d3, h6, b3, d6, bishop b2, knight takes d5, c takes d, knight e7, e4, c5. The c-pawn was weak, and something had to be done to get rid of this weakness. With d takes c, knight takes c6, d4, bishop g4, d5, knight e7. Now we have a pawn chain, and the base of the black chain, the d6 pawn, is already open to attack, just as if a typical attack was carried out with the c-pawns. c2, c4, c5, cx d6 with the response cx d6. Queen d3, queen d7, knight d2. White is already moving the knight to attack the weak base pawn. Bishop h3, a4, strengthening the knight's position on c4 in advance. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2, rook eb8, knight c4, b5, a takes b, queen takes b5, rook a3. In such situations, the question arises, which pawn is weaker, A or B? In this case, this question can be wounded by the deductive method. Since the d6 pawn is weaker than the d5 pawn, the same ratio should be maintained for the pawns remaining on the queen side. If this is not the case, then the move a2, a4 is wrong. This, however, is doubtful. After all, with this move, white strengthened the strategically important c4 point, and it is impossible to allow white not to have the right to play in this way. No, the move nc4 is correct, and so is a4, so the move b7, b5 could not create an unexpectedly favorable position for black. Knight g6. It is possible that nc8 was somewhat better. Rook fa1, a6, bishop c1, rook b7, bishop e3, f6, f3. If black could play f6, f5, his position would not be very bad. But promoting f6, f5 is out of the question. Knight e7, queen f1 with nd6 threat, knight c8, knight d2, queen b4, queen c4, queen takes c4, knight takes c4, rook b8, knight d2, rook c7, rook takes a6. Attention should be paid to white's masterful use of the d2 and c4 points. Rook c2, rook 6a2, rook takes a2, rook takes a2. The end of the game, which boils down to the centralization of the white king and the consequent advance of the cohesive forces, the pawn, the knight, and the king, is not difficult to understand. Bishop e7, king f2, king f7, king e2, king e8, king d3, king d7, king c3, bishop d8, knight c4, square c3, shelter, and c4, cover. Bishop c7, g4, bishop d8, rook a6, bishop c7, h4, bishop d8, h5, bishop c7, b4, rook b7, rook a8, king d8, king b3, rook b8, rook takes b8, bishop takes b8, b5, knight e7, b6, f5, g takes f, knight g8, bishop f2, king c8, bishop h4. Black resigned. A similar picture is presented to us by the next part. d4, d5, c4, c6, e3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, knight f3, knight bd7, bishop d3, d takes c, bishop takes c4, b5, bishop e2, a6, short castling, bishop b7, b3, bishop e7, bishop b2, short castling, knight e5, c5, bishop f3, queen c7, knight takes d7, knight takes d7, knight e4, rook at 8, rook c1, queen b8, queen e2, c takes d, e takes d, rook c8, g3, queen a8, king g2, rook fd8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, rook c1, rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, h6. This is where the strategically interesting exploitation of the d4 weakness begins. Bishop b2, knight b6, h3. Since the exchange of queens is undesirable for white, the move queen c2 due to queen c8, it makes no sense to do it. Queen c8, queen d3, knight d5 with the b4 threat, a3, knight b6, point b3 is now weak. King h2, bishop d5, king g2, queen c6, knight d2, a5, queen c3. In his trouble, white still decides to exchange queens, but loses due to the newly formed reflex weakness. Bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, takes f3, takes f3, move. Queen takes f3 was refuted by means of queen c2, queen b7, knight d5, queen takes c3, bishop takes c3, a4. Now the weakness of the queen side becomes apparent. B takes a. B takes a. White lost, as the attempt to save the game by bishop b4, bishop takes b4, a takes b, a3, knight d2, knight d5, after which the invasion of the white king through e2, d3, and c4 turns out to be impossible. c2 would invariably be followed by nd5, c3 check, and so on. In this excellent endgame, in addition to the transfer of the attack, the masterful use of the d5 point is also noteworthy. As for the method of siege of the isolated pawn, I would like to add that at present we no longer consider it necessary to make the enemy's isolated pawn completely immobile. On the contrary, we willingly give it some opportunity to move and, instead of locking it in a cage, give it the illusion of freedom. The principle of large zoological gardens apply to the small predator, the isolated pawn. The next batch shows how we do it. d4, d5, knight f3, c5, c4, e6, c takes d, e takes d, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, knight f6, short castling, bishop e7, d takes c, bishop takes c5, knight bd2, and now the isolated pawn has the choice of becoming weak on d5 or on d4. Tarish preferred the latter. d4, knight b3, bishop b6, queen d3, bishop e6, rook d1, bishop takes b3, queen takes b3, queen e7, bishop d2, short castling, a4, knight e4, bishop e1, rook at 8, a5, bishop c5, a6, b takes a. If b6 then. Queen a4 with the b4 threat. 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 Rook ac1. All pieces defending the d4 pawn are now suspended in the air. Rook c8. Knight h4. Bishop b6. Knight f5. Queen e5. Bishop takes e4. Queen takes e4. Knight d6 with a gain in quality. So, the isolated queen's pawn is a fairly powerful attack weapon in the midgame, but it can become very weak in the endgame. 2. Isolated pawn pair. Black can exchange the knight c3. If they then manage to delay their opponent's pawns on c3 and d4 and eventually block them, their still somewhat questionable strategy, in xc3, will be justified. The fact is that such pawns detained in their own camp, near the border, to a large extent constrain white. One problem is that you have to constantly take care of defending the c3 and d4 pawns, which is aggravated by another, namely the lack of space. Pawns blocked on c3 and d4, or on c6 and d5 respectively, but only these, I call an isolated pawn pair. A corresponding example is found in the game Taubenhaus, which we considered earlier. The picture changes significantly if white manages to advance the c3 pawn. Then the c4 and d4 pawns appear. They are called hanging. As a rule, the choice between a sedentary isolated pawn pair and hanging pawns is easy to make. Hanging, of course, is preferable for the very reason that they generate threats. And even if these threats were only imaginary, which, however, is not always easy to recognize, a dubious initiative is still better than an undoubted dead passivity. See the Taubenhaus game. Hence the rule. The owner of an isolated pawn pair should make every effort to achieve the c3-c4 advance. Under no circumstances should it allow a blockade. The heavyweight construction of c3, d4 should be for him only a transitional form to the dynamic construction of c4, d4 with the constant threat of c4, c5, or d4, d5. Let us now cite a case in which black, possessing an isolated pawn pair, fought for the realization of the c6, c5 opportunity. c4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight takes c6, b takes c, g3, d5, bishop g2, bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, short castling, rook b8, queen c2. White avoids the move. b3 wishing to maneuver through the square b3, e.g. nb3 or qa4. Rook e8, e3, bishop e6, c takes d. Deserved attention. Knight b3, d takes c, knight d4. C takes d. Black now has the notorious isolated pawn pair. The c7, d5 form deserves to be called isolated even more than the c6, d5 form. And he is quite right to try to advance c7, c5. Knight b3, queen d6, rook fc1, rook ec8, queen c5, queen takes c5, rook takes c5, knight d7, rook a5, to make the blockade chronic with rack 1. c5, rook takes a7, c4, knight d4, rook takes b2, knight takes e6, f takes e, rook takes d7, c3 at the cost of the piece. Black gained mobility for his c-pawn. White can't win now. Bishop h3, c2, bishop takes e6, king f8, rook f7. Perhaps it was bishop f5, king e8, bishop takes c8, rook b1, king g2, rook takes a1. Or c1 queen, rook takes b1, queen takes b1, rook f4, rook c7, c1 queen, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, and on the 42nd move there was an agreement for a draw. 3. Hanging pawns, their origin and features. Self-blockade. The history of the emergence of hanging pawns is captured in diagrams 69 to 71. One look at them is enough to convince us that we intend to trace the pedigree of the hanging pawns from the isolated queen. This pedigree leads in a straight line to the isolated queen's pawn as the ancestor. Such a point of view, the validity of which is easy to prove, will be of considerable service, for it enables us to judge the rather obscure motives of the hanging pawns by their more easily analyzable progenitor, the isolated queen's pawn. The study of the family chronicle will thus help us to understand the essence of one, especially complex, member of the family. From the grandmother, that is, the isolated queen's pawn, the hangers inherited one essential character trait, namely the same strange mixture of static weakness and dynamic strength. But while in an isolated queen's pawn, both weakness and strength are clear as day, remember, if the black pawn is isolated, it needs to be defended on its own, and in addition, it can become weaknesses in the endgame of the d4, c5, e5 square. Strength lies in the presence of outposts e4 and c4, perhaps on occasion the d5, d4 advance, and hanging one such as. So the other is kept in a latent form. In these extremely mysterious natures, properly speaking, only the following is certain. 1. Both hanging pawns are undefended, i.e. not protected by pawns, and for this reason the pressure on them in open squares must be burdensome. 2. With hanging pawns, it is not difficult to achieve a relatively safe position. I mean a position in which one of the pawns defends the other, i.e. c5, d4 or d5, c4. The question arises, if the possibility of relative security just mentioned can be attained only at the price of the renunciation of all initiative in the center, if security almost means readiness to submit to a blockade, then would it not be better to neglect this security and continue to remain in a hanging position? It is not easy to answer this question. It all depends on the circumstances, on the type and details of the upcoming blocking. However, I will say in advance, the security of the blocked complex is a very elastic concept. Blocked pawns can easily become weak. Nevertheless, there are cases when the advance of pawns to a blocked position, so to speak, self-blocking, is in full accordance with the position. These cases are as follows. 1. The pawns that are part of the enemy's blockade ring, in turn, can be attacked. See the b2 pawn in the game Rubinstein, Nimzowitsch, which we will consider later. 2. The blockade is too expensive for the enemy. That is, the necessary blocking apparatus is too large, or the blocking pieces are somehow unsuitable, lack of elasticity, or insignificance of threats from the blocking field. Here are examples of unfavorable positions. An attempt to secure the hanging pawns gave very relative results. The c5 pawn is weak. True, d4 is a passing. The d4 pawn was made up of two hanging c5 and d5 as a result of d5, d4, exd4, cxd4. The d4 pawn is now blocked by kf1, e2, d3, and white gains the advantage. Here, security, as a result of self-blockade, turns out to be deceptive. Advanced pawns become weak. Again, the reason is to be found in the properties of blockers. The knight d3 and the king d3 are excellent blocking pieces. This sufficiently explains the failure of the self-blockade. The truth seems to be this. Just as our valuation of the isolated queen's d4 pawn depended on a greater or lesser degree of its inherent initiative, the outpost point reinforced by the pawn must have had some significance. So we think we are justified in demanding some initiative from the blocked hanging pawns. Complete passivity is hopeless. Here are a few examples. Rubinstein, Nimzowitsch. Followed. Queen a4, Queen b6, Queen a3, c4. Pawn seeks safety in a self-blockade. However, the white blockade ring, the b2 pawn, is attackable. Bishop e2, a5. Rook fd1, Queen b4, Rook d4, Rook fd8, Rook cd1, Rook d7, Bishop f3, Rook at 8, Knight b1. A wait-and-see tactic would be better. Rook 4 d2, and so on. Rook b8, Rook 1 d2, Queen takes a3, Knight takes a3, King f8, e4. This ultimately leads to the loss of a pawn, but White's position is already disadvantageous. The equilibrium that had existed on move 21, the weakness on d5 was balanced by the weakness on b2, gave way to an obvious disproportion. The b2 square now became quite weak. The d5 square, on the contrary, was almost more than defended. D takes e, Rook takes d7, Knight takes d7, Bishop takes e4, Knight c5, Rook d4. Or Bishop c6, Rook b4, Bishop d5, Knight a4 with black's advantage. Knight takes e4, Rook takes e4, Rook takes b2, Knight takes c4, Rook b4, Knight d6, Rook takes e4, Knight takes e4, Bishop takes a2, and black won. In the maestro's practice, the move d5 d4 or d4 d5 from the hanging position c4 d4 is much more common. In a funny way, it leads to the closure of a ring that is not devoid of originality, from an isolated queen through hanging pawns back to an isolated queen. At the same time, the whole question is whether the newly emerged isolated queen's pawn will hold. Knight f3, d5, b3, c5, e3, Knight c6, Bishop b2, Bishop g4, Bishop e2, Queen c7, d4, c takes d, e takes d, e6, short castling, Bishop d6, h3, Bishop takes f3, Bishop takes f3, Knight f6, c4, d takes c, b takes c, short castling, Knight c3 to maintain the position of the hanging pawns. It was possible to play in b1, d2 b3, followed by qd1, e2, ra1, c1, rf1, d1. But I wanted to open up the position with d4 d5, says Nimzowitsch in his book. Rook fd8, Knight b5, Queen e7, Queen e2, Bishop b8, d5, e takes d, Queen takes e7, Knight takes e7, Bishop takes f6, g takes f, c takes d, Bishop e5, Rook add 1, and the d-pawn was not only preserved, but it also compensated for black's pawn superiority on the queen side throughout the rest of the game. The values of the d5 pawn should not have been underestimated. Tartakower underestimated and lost. The game was not so successful for the owner of hanging pawns in this position. Queen a3, Knight e4, Rook d3, Rook fd8, Rook fd1, Queen e6, Knight d2, Queen b6, Knight f1, Knight f6, Knight g3, Rook ac8, h3, h6, Knight e2, Rook d7, Knight c3, Queen e6, Queen a5, d4. Black is tired of the eternal threat, and he decides to break the hanging position of the pawns by self-blocking, but this could easily end in trouble for him. E takes d. C takes d. Knight b5. How do you save the now isolated queen's pawn? Queen f5. A series of precise countermaneuvers follow. Queen a4. Rook c1. Rook takes c1. Queen takes d3. Rook c8. King h7. Queen c2. Queen takes c2. Rook takes c2. d3. Rook d2. The d3 pawn is still in danger. Knight e4. Rook d1. Rook b7. Final liquidation. Knight c3. Knight takes c3. B takes c. Rook b2. Rook takes d3. Rook takes a2 draw. It is useful for the student to pay attention to the ways of indirectly defending the d-pawn. Such a strategic technique is another chance for the defender to get rid of difficulties with hanging pawns and improve the position. In general, the hanging position of pawns should be looked at as a transitional state. It is just a matter of catching the right moment to eliminate this state. Usually, the defender advances one of the pawns too early. The preservation of an indefinite, hanging state is avoided because the consciousness that you are floating in the air is apparently still alien to the human psyche. Be that as it may, we must present one requirement to our viewer. If you are going to advance one of the hanging pawns, do not do it until you see at least a shadow of initiative in the position that arises as a result of the promotion. You should not be exposed to the danger of a complete and hopeless blockade under any pretense. It is better to float further. For two bishops. The superiority of a long-range bishop over a knight, suffering from shortness of breath. Black also loses when the knight is on c3, d4, or f8. Two bishops in the hands of a connoisseur are a terrible weapon. And yet, for a moment, I had a thought, I confess, almost criminal, that this weapon should not be examined in detail in my book. My system, I said to myself, knows only two kinds of things that it recognizes as worthy of detailed investigation: the elements of the game and the strategic techniques and problems. For example, the isolated queen's pawn, which seemed to us somehow organically connected with the problem of restricting mobility, was a strategic problem for us. But where to place the bishops? The question cannot simply be ignored as idle or idle. On the contrary, it seems to us theoretically interesting. A detailed substantiation of my personal opinion would lead us too far, so I thought it sufficient to report only the conclusion. I had come to the conviction that the advantage of two bishops could not be classified either as an element in our sense of the word or as a strategic. Both bishops were and are for me merely a kind of weapon. The study of different types of weapons, the solution of the question of what role they play in this or that case, is not at all part of the plan of my book. On the contrary, Berger's point of view is the leitmotif of the book on the endgame. Nevertheless, the viewer has the right, of course, to expect me to illuminate the dangers posed by enemy bishops. And I have to reckon with this. The superiority of the bishop over the knight is especially evident in the following group of positions. Each of the partners has one, or more, passed pawns supported by the king. The bishop wins because his ability to impede the advance of the enemy's passed pawns is amazing, or to slow down the pace of this advance. On the other hand, the position on the screen reveals the bishop's greatest weakness. If it is a matter of protecting space, it is usually helpless, for how could a bishop in the black fields affect the white points? The cases in the last two diagrams should be considered as two poles, between which the other cases fit. Range is the name of an advantage. The weakness of the fields of inaccessible color is the name given to the fatal defect peculiar to the bishop. One more thing. This proposition, in the presence of other forces, does not convince us of the superiority of the bishop over the knight. As well as this position, the superiority of the knight. In both cases, the matter is decided by strategic superiority, the advantage of aggressive positioning of pieces over passive ones, but not by the superiority of the type of weapon itself, which in some cases may exist. To summarize, the main weakness of the bishop lies in the squares of a colo inaccessible to him. The main strength is in the range. And now it becomes clear why two bishops are so strong. The strength is doubled, and the weakness just emphasized is neutralized by the other bishop. It is hardly possible to describe all the heterogeneous situations in which the action of both bishops can be unpleasant. We will try, however, to note the most important of them. A. Hurwitz's bishops. This is the name given to two bishops acting on two adjacent diagonals, for example, BB2 and BD3, in order to fire at the enemy's castling position with combined forces. Their effect is sometimes crushing. One of the bishops forces a pawn move, which opens the way for the other bishop. Queen e4 forces a pawn move that exposes the king, after which g6, after which bishop d4 turns out to be disastrous. The events in the following game are similar. e4, e5, d4, e takes d, c3, d takes c, bishop c4, c takes b, bishop takes b2, bishop b4, knight c3, knight f6, knight e2, knight takes e4, short castling, knight takes c3, knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3. Short castling, black castled and feels armed to the teeth against both qg4, g7, g6, and qd4, qd8, g5. However, they do not take into account the ability of Hurwitz's bishops to coordinate actions. Queen g4, g6, queen d4 with irresistible checkmate. The role of the bishop on c4 is obvious. It tied up the pawn f7. As a variety of Hurwitz's bishops, and of a finer quality, I would like to classify the bishops in the position in diagram 83. Only the most important pieces are given. Two bishops attack the pawn mass with the intention of taking possession of squares that are convenient positions for one of the bishops. There is no attack on the king here, but the pressure on a7 will force black to eventually go to the a7, b6, c5 pawn configuration, after which another bishop will act. a2, a4, b2, b3 will follow, and the f1 bishop gets excellent positions on a6, b5, and especially on c4. In addition, black's pawn superiority on the queen side is also devalued. A similar strategic technique is found in Maroczy's parties. B. Advance of pawns in order to limit the movement of knights. The pawn mass, it is not necessary for this to be a pawn superiority, is advanced quite far forward with the support of two bishops and thus restricts the mobility of the enemy knights. In the end, the possibility of a breakthrough opens up. An example is the following well-known game. Black restricts the freedom of action of the knights. c5, knight g3, h5, f3. White defends himself, not realizing what is happening. To avoid defeat, it is necessary to create strong and safe positions for the knights. It was necessary to play a4 followed by nc4. Bishop d7, rook e2, b5, rook ae1, bishop f8, knight g4, rook g8, to play f6, f5, knight b3, rook c8, knight ed2, bishop d6, knight e4, bishop f8, knight ed2, f5, rook e5, bishop d6, rook 5 times 10 squared, rook d5, rook g6, Rook a8, the turn behind the a pawn. Knight a5, rook b8. Otherwise, the move nb7 will disrupt all the work on restricting mobility. Knight b3, h4, king h1, rook g6, king g1. Bishop e6. The protection of the e-file from the intrusion of rooks in the position of the bishops on d6 and d7 had been somewhat abstract before this excellent move. After b6, the abstract barrier turns into a material one. We have already considered such a case when the restriction of the mobility of the passed pawn by ranged pieces gave way to a mechanical stop, blockade. Such is the strategic theoretical significance of the maneuver chosen by black. The practical significance of the move bd7, e6, as Tarish himself quite rightly notes, is that it creates two new possibilities. 1. kf7, e7 d7. 2. a7, a6, rb8, c8, then bd6, b8, a7, and finally c5, c4. To this I would like to add that the c5, c4 advance here is generally a natural plan from a strategic point of view. We will explain why in a note a little later. Rook f2. Rook a8. Black reverses his main plan, c5, c4, and tries to implement a7, a5 again. They succeed, but only because the enemy loses sight of a subtle resource. Without a doubt, it is wonderful to execute a5, a4 with a complete pushback, but you cannot subordinate a strategically correct plan to the idea of a greater decorative action. In general, the pseudo-classical school suffered from an incredible weakness for decorative effects. Rook f2, a fatal mistake. How is it possible to allow a7, a5 without a fight? On the knight a5, Tarish indicates the following option. Bishop c7, knight b7, bishop f4 with a time gain for ra8, c8 due to the threat of bf4, e3, followed by c5, c4. But he does not notice the hidden defense. Knight takes c5, bishop e3, c4. After that, black cannot win, since white's queen side is strong and black squares are no less strong. For example, c5 for the knight. A possible continuation would be b takes c, d takes c, rook c8, b4, rook c7, king f1, bishop takes f2, king takes f2, and white has a good position. a5, knight b1, a4, knight 3d2. Now comes the breakthrough, which, strictly speaking, is not unexpected because black, as we know, has a certain qualitative advantage. Imagine a white pawn on e4 and a black pawn on e5. Then the matter becomes quite obvious. In this case, the breakthrough is also favored by the sad position of the knights and the length of the front, 4 pawns against 4. c4, knight f1, rook c8, king h1, c3, b takes c, d takes c, knight e3. b for the endgame plays out like a clockwork. White resigned on move 47. c, limiting the mobility of the knights while fighting against pawn superiority. A difficult task, it will be said, requires outstanding technique. Not at all. Those who are more or less versed in the art of restricting the mobility and blocking of the enemy's pawn complexes will very soon state with satisfaction that in this group of positions it is easier to limit the mobility of the knights than in the previous group. With some right, we could say that a complete restriction of the pawn majority's mobility automatically entails a restriction of the knight's mobility. In other words, the blocked pawns themselves take away all the squares from the knights. Consider the following example. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, short castling, knight takes e4, d4, knight d6, bishop takes c6, d takes c, d takes e, knight f5, queen takes d8, King takes d8. Bishop g5. Better. Knight c3. King e8. Knight e2 and in f4. King e8. Knight c3. h6. Bishop f4. Bishop e6. White's pawn majority is inactive. Rook ad1. Rook d8. Knight e4. c5. Rook takes d8. King takes d8. Rook d1. King c8. h3. b6. King f1. Bishop e7. a3. Rook d8. Rook takes d8. King takes d8. The exchange of rooks to a large extent increased the activity of the black king. c3. Bishop d5. Knight fd2. King d7. King e2. g5. Bishop h2. Knight h4. g3. Knight g6. f4. King e6. King e3. c4. Knight f3. G takes f. G takes f. c5. The white pieces are quite thoroughly locked. This phenomenon arose as a result of black's successful blocking of the e5 pawn and especially the f4 pawn. For us, there is nothing surprising here, for we have seen more than once what a miraculous effect the blockade has on the whole position. Knight g3. Knight h4. Knight takes h4. Bishop takes h4. Knight e4. Bishop e7. Bishop g1. Bishop c6. With the intention of continuing kd5 and bc6. d7 f5, with further pushing back the knight. Bishop f2. Bishop d7. Bishop g3. An attempt to play for a draw would be knight d6 to achieve opposite-colored bishops. King d5. Knight f2. h5. King f3. Bishop f5. Blockade. King e3. b5. King f3. a5. King e3. White is stalemated. b4. King f3. King c6. A takes b. The game is lost. C takes b. C takes b. A takes b. Knight e4. King d5. Knight d6. Bishop takes d6. E takes d. c3. B takes c. b3. White resigned. d. Two bishops in the endgame. Black takes turns converting the different chances of his bishops. The strengths of the bishops, which we talked about above, manifest themselves in the endgame in a combined form. We consider the ideal to be the transformation of an advantage rooted only in the kind of weapon into a pronounced strategic advantage, for example, into the advantage of an aggressive position of the pieces compared to the passive placement of the opponent's pieces. White consolidated his position. The weakness of the black squares c3 and d4 does not seem to matter. King g1. King g7. King f1. Bishop c6. Knight g1. g5. Knight f3. h5. These two pawns advance, since with the support of both bishops they are aware of their qualitative superiority. Bishop e2. Rook e4. Bishop d3. Rook f4. King e2. g4. H takes g. H takes g. Knight h2. g3. Knight f3. Black does the right thing by giving up the advantage he has achieved, limiting the mobility of the knight. What they have now gained is more valuable. The g2 pawn has become an object of attack, and the white pieces, especially the f3 knight, are now forced to constantly take care of defending it. This strategic advantage soon decides the game. d4. Rook f1. b4. Knight d2. Rook h4. Knight f3. Rook h8. From here the rook threatens both the h2 point and the e-file. King d2. Where there are no good moves, there is often a mistake, Tarish once said. Rook h2. Knight takes h2. G takes h. Rook h1. Bishop e5. Bishop f1. Bishop e4. A delightful position. King d1. King f6. king d2, king g5, king e1, king g4. White resigned. Enough has been done to glorify bishops. Now let's say a few words about the positions in which bishops are not so good. These are closed or semi-closed positions. Against a knight established in the center, bishops are strikingly weak. And in the position, it seems to me, black can withstand the action of Horwitz's bishops. Knight f3, e6, g3, d5, bishop g2, c6, b3, bishop d6, bishop b2, knight f6, d3, knight bd7, knight bd2, queen c7. It is possible, and e5. The move in the game is the beginning of an original maneuver. Black has conceived an attack on the queen side, but wants to first secure the center from a possible threat e2, e4, e5. So, the systematic implementation of overprotection of the central point e5. In particular, the queen has a spare square on b8, where it can retreat if necessary, for example, when the c-line is opened. Short castling. a5. c4. b5. The question of the timing of a flank attack always depends on the position in the center. With a fortified position in the center, a flank attack cannot be absolutely wrong. So it is here. What if the king has not yet rooked? He is still safe. C takes b. C takes b. Rook c1. Queen b8. Queen c2, e4. Short castling. e4. Bishop b7. Knight d4. Rook c8. Queen b1. Rook takes c1. Rook takes c1. b4. Knight c6. This move seems a little premature to me. Bishop takes c6. Rook takes c6. a4. Every free chance is used to strengthen the position on the queen side. d4. This move should be regarded as a success of black strategy built on the principle of overprotection. The important diagonal of b2 f6 is now blocked, but otherwise it would be impossible to advance e4 e5, 5. It is also worth mentioning the move of f4, in which the d3 pawn remains in place. It could have followed bishop c5, and white still has to play d4 after bishop f8, e5. The situation would have been the same as in the game. Bishop f8, e5, knight e8. White bishops are inactive. f4, queen b5. More precisely, there was an immediate a3. Queen c2, a3. Bishop c1. It was necessary to play bf1 beforehand. Bishop c5. This interesting combination would have to start with the move and c5. The difference will soon become clear. Rook takes c5. Knight takes c5. D takes c. The move bf1, impossible at nc5, would give white extra tempo for the endgame. Rook c8. The a2 pawn, who would have thought, is doomed. Knight b1. Queen takes c5. Queen takes c5. Rook takes c5. Bishop takes a3. Or bishop d2. Rook c2. Bishop f1. Rook takes a2. Bishop takes b4. Rook g2, and black wins. If white had extra tempo, this variation would not be possible. B takes a. Knight takes a3. Rook a5. Knight c2. Rook takes a2. Knight d4. Rook b2. f5. Knight c7. F takes e. Knight takes e6. Knight c6. d4. White resigned. The next game is an illustration of the isolated queen's pawn. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, e3, c5, bishop d3, knight c6, short castling, d takes c, bishop takes c4, c takes d, e takes d, bishop e7, knight c3, Short castling. Bishop e3, e3, e3. It was bad. d5 due to. Knight a5, b3. Bishop b4. It is also unrespectable. Bishop g5, b6 and so on. b6, maneuvers a7, a6, and b7 b5 would unnecessarily weaken c5. Queen e2, bishop b7, rook fd1, knight b4, knight e5, rook c8, rook ac1, knight bd5. Knight b5, an interesting concept from a strategic point of view. White says to himself, everything is solid in the center, so the diversion is strategically justified. On the other hand, there is no desire to get hanging pawns after boss 6 or bd3. Objectively correct, however, it would still be. Bishop a6, for example. Knight takes c3, b takes c, queen c7, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, c4, and then, on occasion, a2, a4, a5. a6, knight a7, rook a8. If rook c7, then bishop takes a6, knight ac6, queen d6, knight takes e7, queen takes e7, bishop d3, knight takes e3. There was no need for this yet. It deserved attention. a5 followed by rfc8. Or rook fd8 followed by nf6, d7, and nd7, f8. F takes e, b5, weakens paragraph c5. It's better. a5 followed by rfc8. Rook c5. By occupying this outpost point, white gets a game on the c-file. Rook fc8, rook dc1, g6, a3. The following could serve as an educational example of using an open line. The slowness with which white takes possession of space step by step is characteristic of positional play. Knight e8, b4, knight d6. If queen g5, then knight takes f7, queen f2, f5 to destroy the pressure on point f7. In addition, the move qg5 becomes possible. Queen f4, knight e8. Black can't do anything. Bishop e2, knight d6, bishop f3 destroys resistance in the c line. Rook takes c5, d takes c, knight e8. If knight e4, then c6, g5, c takes b, rook f8, rook c8, and white wins. White wins. White wins. White wins. White wins. Rook d1, knight f6, c6, the c pawn, the result of the operation on the queen side, now decides the game. Bishop c8, c7, rook a7, rook d8, king g7, rook takes c8, rook takes c7, knight takes g6. Black resigned. This game is dedicated to hanging pawns and is very characteristic of them, but only in a very special sense. It reveals the dangers to which hanging pawns are exposed as soon as they arise. The percentage of infant mortality here is very high and significantly exceeds the percentage of mortality of slightly grown, strengthened pawns. The latter, in case of need, can resort to self-blockade. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, e3, knight bd7, Knight f3, short castling, queen c2, b6. Perhaps c5 for example. C takes d, knight takes d5, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight takes d5, e takes d, d takes c, knight takes c5. We really like the isolated queen's pawn here. C takes d, e takes d, bishop d3, bishop b7, long castling, knight e4, h4, f5, king b1, c5. The correctness of this move depends entirely on the correctness of the pawn sacrifice recommended by us in the next footnote. Solid and well indicated by Lasker sequel. Rook c8 for example. Queen b3. Knight takes c3 followed by c7 c5. Less solid, but apparently not bad. h6 for example. Bishop f4. Bishop d6. Bishop takes d6. C takes d. D takes c. B takes c. Perhaps it was rook c8 with c takes b. Knight d4. Knight d takes c5. Knight takes b6. Black has chances to attack, and knight d4 could have followed. Knight c5. The outcome of the game in each of these cases would have been uncertain, but now it is not subject to any doubt. Any doubt. Any doubt. By the way, here you need to pay attention to the knight d takes c5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop c4, and white wins. Knight takes e4, f takes e, bishop takes e4, d takes e, queen b3, king h8, queen takes b7, e takes f, rook takes d7, queen e8, rook takes e7, queen g6, king a1, rook b8. The storm not only swept away the hanging pawns, but also carried away the piece. A desperate attack made by black is repelled without difficulty. Queen e4. Lasker praises this move, but it seems that queen d5 for example, f takes g, queen takes g2, queen c2, bishop f6. Already several roads lead to Rome. Queen takes e4, rook takes e4, f takes g, rook g1, rook takes f2, rook f4, rook c2. On. Rook b takes b2 resolves. Rook f8. b3. h6. Bishop e7. Rook e8. King b1. Rook e2. Bishop takes c5. Rook d8. Bishop d4. Rook c8. Rook g4. Black resigned. The viewer will find an excellent game with two bishops at the end of the 5th chapter. Well, friends, we have completed our detailed analysis of two fundamental topics, the isolated queen's pawn and the power of the two bishops. We have seen that in the hands of a connoisseur, an isolated pawn is not a burden, but a dynamic lever that creates the most dangerous outposts and sets the pace for the entire attack. At the same time, we saw the two-facedness of the two bishops, their incredible range, and, at the same time, their vulnerability if the opponent skillfully uses fields of color that are inaccessible to them. Remember Nimzowicz's words, if you have decided to advance pawns in such a structure, do it only when you feel at least a shadow of initiative. It is better to float in the air, maintaining tension, than to doom yourself to a hopeless blockade. In the next issue, we move on to the crown of Nimzowicz's strategic thought, the theory of overprotection. We will find out why the defense of a strategically important point by an extra defender is not a reassurance, but a way to endow your pieces with internal energy and vitality. We will see how the reserve defenders at the right moment turn from passive observers into active attackers, and we will learn to get rid of the weaknesses that hinder our development. It will be a difficult but incredibly instructive chapter. Get your boards ready. We continue to dissect the art of positional combat. See you.